Hey guys. This is part 4 of What If Naruto and Sasuke became friends a few years early. Hit like and subscribe if you like this one, and also please check the author in the description. Let's start.
We are pain, that's all. We are God.
Chapter 11. Sensei? The blonde-haired child spoke curiously, sitting down at the foot of Kakashi's bed with his teammates, and generally trying to create as much ruckus as he could. What are the Chunin exams? The man coughed violently, hacking into his own sheets as he desperately tried to pretend he hadn't heard that. It had been his idea to simply not tell his team about the exams, and hope they'd miss the cutoff point for entering. Naruto, you didn't know? Sakura spoke out, standing and picking up a magazine from beside his bed, flipping it around a bit before settling on a specific page. She pushed it up into her teammate's face and gestured towards it. The Chunin exams are a biannual event, held by each village on a rotating schedule, open to all other villages. The Leaf Village is hosting this year. Oh, seriously? Naruto peered a bit skeptically at the article, reading for just a moment, before he let out a small huh. There was a small bit of silence as the boy continued to read, accompanied only by the soft ticking of a clock on the opposite wall, before, with a gasp, Naruto turned back towards the three of them. Wait a second, that means we get to compete, right? Kakashi coughed awkwardly, not quite sure how to disappoint the boy without, well, disappointing the boy. Obviously not, doofus, Sasuke spoke up, lightly smacking the boy on his shoulder, before pointing down at the words on the page. It says right here we need a Jonin sensei, and ours is out of commission. Ah, what? The blonde fell backwards, scrunching down onto the mattress beneath him and letting out a long, pained whine. But I wanna! Did you not hear me earlier? It's biannual. Sakura sat back down on the bed, just beside Naruto and Sasuke. You'll get another chance in a couple months, and you'll get to have a lot more training going into it. Hell, I don't even know if we'd be ready for it if we took it now. But wouldn't that be half the fun? Naruto spoke up, holding his arms wide around him. I mean, it's like we're the main characters or something. Naruto made a serious face, parodying a character one might read about in an ancient tale. Caught with their backs against the wall, can our heroes defeat the world's strongest ninja, and rise to the rank of Chunin? He finished by raising his hands into the air and taking a very dramatic action pose. Sasuke chopped him on his forehead a second later, and the boy gave a small ow as he let his arms fall back onto the bed. I really was planning on letting you all take them, though, Kakashi spoke up, closing his Aika book and setting it on his bedside table. You've all exceeded my expectations. I really didn't think you'd have that much of a problem with the exams. Really? Naruto looked over to him, eyes sparkling. Really? He smiled back at the boy, and watched as his face lit up, looking back towards the other two and smiling a bit embarrassedly. He noticed that the boy never really took compliments well, and whether that was a result of his upbringing, or just a small personality quirk, he didn't think it to be all that important. It was endearing, at the very least. So wait. Naruto spoke up a second later, scratching his chin. All we'd have to do to compete is get a Jonin sensei? Kakashi didn't really know how to respond to the look of raw mischief on the boy's face, like he just thought of the world's most amazing prank. I suppose? Naruto's eyes widened, and he looked suspiciously like a certain nine-tailed fox himself as he chuckled, rubbing his hands together in a way that made him look a bit like an evil genius. I don't much like that expression. Sasuke spoke, eyes narrowed in a suspicious way. What are you planning? Oh, nothing. Naruto slid off of the bed, took calm, careful steps towards the door, and gave them a shit-eating grin of frankly epic proportions. I've just got an idea is all. And with that, the boy closed the door behind him, the sounds of his footsteps echoing into their room for only a second or two longer before they too faded. Why does he only ever look like that when he's trying to do something stupid? Sakura sighed, massaging her temple with her fingers, making small circles. I swear, enemies would run the hell away if they saw him look like that in a fight, but no, It's all screaming and shadow clones. I don't think they'd run, Sasuke spoke, grinning as he twirled a pencil in his fingers. They'd probably just laugh at him, and then all of a sudden they'd find themselves caught in a 30-layer trap. Yeah, that sounds about right. The girl laughed as she said it, leaning back onto the bed with a sigh. The only reason we know to avoid him when he's like that is experience. What do you guys mean? Kakashi leaned back into his pillows, trying to get comfortable as he listened to his students talk. Sakura grinned, as did Sasuke, the two of them sharing a small look before giggling a bit. Everyone thinks Naruto's this dumb oaf, but he's actually pretty smart. He just doesn't apply any of it to things that don't interest him. Sasuke raised his arms up in a what-can-you-do gesture. I mean, who else could figure out a way to set up an entire scaffold rigging on the Hokage monument, and make it so that he could paint all 4 of the faces in just a few days? Kakashi laughed just thinking about it. The boy must have thought long and hard about it, slaving away in a notebook somewhere as he came up with plans. Or perhaps he was more like himself, and things just came naturally to him. Perhaps Naruto was better on the fly. That does seem a bit ridiculous. Oh, but it doesn't stop there. Sakura spoke up this time, groaning as she massaged her face with her hands again. When we were trying to figure out a way to get back at you for leaving us on the training field for 3 hours, and telling us not to eat anything, it was Naruto who came up with the idea to set all of us up as his clones. I mean, honestly, if he'd applied that level of intellect to class, he probably could have been a top student or something. The pink-haired girl sighed, smiling a bit even still. If I'm being honest, though, I just don't think that would have worked. What wouldn't have worked? Kakashi asked. Naruto as some genius. Sakura spoke, looking towards Sasuke and smirking, holding in her laughter. I mean, could you imagine Naruto as some broody edgelord like him? I resent that. The black-haired boy spoke out quietly, looking a bit annoyed at his teammate, who rolled with laughter as she fell back onto the bed. Kakashi himself smiled as he looked upon his students' faces. As they argued incessantly about this and that, he could tell that they all truly cared for one another. They sat for a while after that, doing various different things. Kakashi himself took to rereading his favorite chapters for the umpteenth time, going back through them with a fine-toothed comb to try and find anything he missed. He was just about to give up and try to find something else to do when the door was practically kicked down, and Naruto entered the room, dragging a disgruntled-looking Zabuza behind him. "Ta-da!" Naruto exclaimed, gesturing towards the confused-looking assassin with both of his hands. What?" Sakura spoke, scratching the side of her head. "That's my question as well," the Mist Ninja said, as he pulled his arm free from Naruto's. "You said there was a situation, so what the hell are we doing here?" "Well, there was a situation, though it perhaps wasn't as serious as I made it sound." Naruto rubbed his chin, looking down at the floor. "But that doesn't matter." Zabuza exclaimed, looking for the second time since Kakashi had met the man completely lost for words. "It kind of does matter." Naruto continued on like the man hadn't spoken at all. "I found us our Jonin-sensei." A strange silence once again descended upon the room, and Kakashi looked around to see his students with confused, yet curious looks on their faces. "Wait, really?" "No, not really," Zabuza shouted, looking down towards Naruto with an annoyed expression. "I never once agreed to that." Semantics. The blonde boy waved his hand, as if to dispel the man's paltry argument. "It is very much so not semantics." Kakashi was desperately holding in a laugh, trying not to crack and have the assassin from the mist murder him. "I'm not going to be your babysitter," the demon of the mist exclaimed, standing over Naruto, and casting a shadow upon him. "Find someone else, because I'm not doing it." "So I agreed to be their Jonin-sensei," his master spoke, as Haku aimlessly poked and prodded at the flowers on the wall. "Oh? I wouldn't have thought you'd want to do that." "Well, I obviously don't want to, but the Hokage said that if I did, then he would reduce my wait time to be able to take on missions to the end of the Chunin exams, instead of the usual 6 months for defectors." "Why is it 6 months?" The ice user felt like asking, not really seeing too much of a point in a wait at all. It's because of spies and their ilk, Zabuza commented, leaning against the doorway behind him. Basically, having 6 months to be able to tell if someone's a spy among hundreds of ninja in the village to keep an eye on them is a lot better than immediately sending them out on missions, where only a handful of others can watch them at any time. Oh, okay. Haku realized the point now. It was just a security measure. The Leaf Village was just being as careful as it could be. Still, if they were so paranoid, why open their borders to defectors at all? Zabuza massaged his temples, groaning aloud as he looked around the shop. Brat, could you at least try and be subtle about this? What are you talking about? Haku felt a bead of sweat slide down his face. I'm just picking some flowers. The same flowers? For 20 minutes? His master shot him an unimpressed look as he pointed towards the front desk, where a certain blonde-haired girl sat, looking bored as she clicked the back of a pen over and over. In direct line of sight of your crush over there? Haku coughed and hacked, sputtering out denials as fast as he could. I don't like her, I'm just here for the flowers. Zabuza gave him a deadpan expression. Honestly, they have an incredibly impressive selection. His master looked to be barely registering what he was saying. I am being completely serious. I really don't like her like that. So you admit you do like her? What? No. I said that I don't like her. Why preface that statement with like that then? Because that is to say, I'm... Zabuza sighed, giving a small groan of pain as well. Goddamn puberty. What the hell is this puberty thing anyways? The entire shop went silent, and Haku realized with a pale face that he just screamed that quite loudly. Ask someone else. What? But why? Kid, I do an awful lot for you. Zabuza kneeled down in front of him, and gave him a completely honest look. But I absolutely refuse to give you the talk. A boy's body hit dirt at breakneck speeds, a small crater forming around him as he groaned out in pain, before sitting up a second later. An outstretched palm was all he could see, poised to strike him once more. The boy already knew the words that would come from his master's mouth before they were spoken. Winner Niji! Gai-sensei shouted loudly, raising his left arm, and pointing it towards the Hyuga, who stood out of his crouch and walked over towards his other teammate, Tenten, leaning against a wooden log a ways away. Lee pounded his fist into the dirt as he got up, feeling more than a little aggravated with himself. He'd never beaten Niji, and he knew he never would. Well, that wasn't true. With the work he was putting into his current fights with the boy, he knew he'd never defeat him. Lee knew he could beat the boy, but that battle was reserved for a more serious occasion, one where others would watch and see that hard work could truly defeat genius. An occasion like the Chunin exams, for instance. He'd unleash the forbidden jutsu his master had taught him, he'd take off the weights that he always wore, and he'd show the world the true power of effort. He walked over to his master and teammates, who were all taking drinks out of their flasks and talking neutrally. It was strange, though, because it seemed like everyone was talking a bit more forcibly than usual, making small talk for the sake of it. Team Guy had never had a truly friendly relationship. He'd have likened it to more of a working relationship, where everyone knew it'd be easier to get along than not to. Tenten made an absent comment about the upcoming exams, which seemed to pull Niji's attention towards her, and he idly spoke about their team's chances, or, more than likely, his own. It's obvious we'll be the victors. We have destiny on our side after all. Niji gave a small chuckle, as if he was above it all. Just follow my lead in the earlier stages, and I'll win us the knockouts for free. Don't get overconfident, Niji, Gai-sensei said, putting his hand on the boy's shoulder. Being sure of oneself is good, but underestimating one's opponent can only lead to failure. Is it truly underestimating them if I am giving them the benefit of the doubt? Niji scoffed, flicking the man's hand off of his shoulder and walking away from them all. They simply have no hope against me. It's not terribly hard to figure it out. Their teacher sighed as the boy walked out of earshot, leaving to go and train himself even more. Despite his proclamations that the weak could never overcome the strong through training, Niji seemed to be fairly hypocritical in continuing to train despite that. Lee felt that perhaps he should have pointed that out, but he didn't particularly care either way. It honestly made him feel a bit better about his internal dislike of the boy whenever he was rude or mean to them all. It helped to make him feel justified. And that internal dislike made him feel disgusted with himself. Niji had had just as tough a life as any of them, and the things that had happened to him were no better than what had happened to himself. It was as he was agonizing over this and that guy sensei walked over and sat down next to him, smiling up at him with a small sparkle on his pearly white teeth. Learn anything, Lee? From that fight, guy sensei? He looked back towards their small arena, the hole in the ground into which Niji had launched him, and admitted. I shouldn't try and come at him from below. Niji's Byakugan gives him a full 360-degree range of vision, thusly an attack from any angle might as well be an attack from the front. Meaning? Guy smiled up at him to show him that he was on the right track, but having to say what the both of them already knew didn't make him feel much better. Meaning that I simply have to work on my fundamentals more. There's no real trick to beating him. He looked towards the edge of the horizon, where he could just make out the figure of Niji disappearing over the top of it. The only thing that can defeat him is skill. Unfortunately for you, his teacher spoke out, standing with a small smile. You're correct. Guy-sensei looked back towards the third member of their team, who was reading a combat manual about one of her new tools. And what about you, Tenten? You lost to both Lee and Niji today. What did you learn? Lee winced, knowing that the girl had always struggled to take wins off of either of them. Her strategy of sticking in one spot and throwing out attacks from it was highly effective on a battlefield, for instance, but against just one other ninja, far faster than you? It was more like suicide. I didn't learn anything today, sensei, Tenten admitted with a frown, though she covered it a second later with the fakest smile Lee had ever seen. I have to be more agile in order to deal with faster opponents, which directly counteracts my style of being an immovable fortress. You could do to be more versatile, Tenten. Their master spoke up, as he walked over to the girl and gave her a pat on the back. It isn't your fault that you're pitted against two of the fastest ninja in the Leaf Village, but it is your fault that you refuse to learn to fight against those who counteract your style. On the battlefield, such straightforwardness could get you killed. The girl gave a small growl, but took a deep breath, calming herself down as she looked up towards her teacher. Then, sensei, what would you have me do? Learn to use each of your weapons, or hell, Guy picked up a crescent-shaped blade from the ground, a small sickle, and handed it to Tenten. Learn to use just one of your weapons in your offhand as a defensive measure. Guy took the small sickle in one hand, flipped it around a few times, and tossed it to the other, effortlessly wielding the weapon. Teach yourself some mild hand-to-hand combat, and learn specifically how to disengage from an opponent with superior speed then. You think I haven't tried that? The sound of birds flapping off in the distance was the only sound in the clearing for quite a while. Both Lee and Guy stood silently, shocked that the normally quiet and friendly Tenten would yell with such vitriol. I'm just not that good at it, sensei. Tenten let out in a sad voice, covering her face with her hands. I'm no prodigy with this stuff, okay? I tried to learn how to use a weapon in my left hand, but by the time I draw it, my chakra points have already been shut down by Niji, or I've already taken a kick to the stomach from Lee, or some other kid has cast a jutsu on me. The girl balled her fists, striking the earth she sat upon with all her might. I'm not fast enough, or I'm not strong enough, or I'm not versatile enough. She stood up, not quite screaming at them, but certainly talking a lot louder than she usually did. I can't even beat a kid who has no chakra at all. No one spoke, and even nature itself, usually uncaring to the plights of man, seemed to stand in perfect stillness for just a moment. The world was completely quiet as Guy reached his hand out to the girl, who batted it away. Lee had been wrong earlier, because he could say with fair certainty that the smile the girl wore now was the fakest smile he'd ever seen. Sorry, you too, I don't know what came over me there. Tenten gave a quiet, mirthless laugh, as she walked over to where she'd been sitting before and grabbed her bag of tools, along with her massive weapons summoning scroll. That was really weird, huh? Me of all people, right? Tenten, are you Dash? Well then, the girl in front of them looked to be trying desperately to get the two of them to forget they saw anything at all, waving forcefully at the two of them with her left hand as she slung the large weapons scroll along her shoulder. I suppose I'll talk to the both of you later. The girl took a step backwards, then another, and gave them another mirthless laugh. It cut off about halfway through, giving way to a small squeaking sound. A second later, Tenten turned around and fled, running away from their clearing and into the forests beyond. Guy seemed to be completely spent, falling to a heap on the ground, letting out a long, pained sigh. Hey, Lee? Yes, Sensei? The man gave him a sad smile that looked so terribly foreign on his face. Where did I mess this up? So, you see, Zabuza spoke with a red face, looking truly mortified as he spoke the next words. When a boy and girl love each other or something. Haku gasped, desperately trying once again to escape the rope he'd been tied down with. His master had suddenly started talking about this stuff after they'd left the flower shop, saying that it was for Haku's own good. He didn't believe that bullshit for 1 second. This stuff was horrifying. When he tried to run away the first time, the man had tied him to a chair, forcing him to listen to his insane babbling. Master, please, whatever I've done to deserve this, I apologize. He has to take out his. Why? What did I do? Haku struggled horribly against the ropes, biting down on them with his teeth. What have I done? And put it in her. Master, I'm begging you, Haku screeched out. At this point, I'd rather you just kill me. No, brat, Zabuza spoke, completely serious, despite his pale, and yet still flushed face. I can't do that. Why? Why the hell can't you do that? Zabuza looked him dead in the eyes, the man's face for the first time what Haku could call a demon. Because that would be too easy. He spoke, even past the shaking of his lips. For the both of us. A loud scream emanated from the depths of the women's bath, as all of the patrons ran towards the changing room, holding towels up to their bodies to cover their private areas. Hey, wait! A voice called out as an old, white-haired man waded through the water, chasing after them. Come back! He was hit in the face a second later by a small washing bin, and then another, before, with a chorus of "Get out, pervert!" a bombardment of items began to make their way towards the white-haired old man. He let out a small yell as he ran away, nearly cresting atop the surface of the water as he jumped the bamboo fence separating the male and female baths, and then the next fence that led out into the village. As he landed upon the stone road below him, he got a pretty good look at his outfit. Or in this case, lack thereof. Mommy, why isn't that man wearing any clothes? Who's that, Dad? Is he a pervert? Why, yes, dear, he is. The old man took a look around, and then, with a teary face, ran away into the streets, screaming back towards all who had seen him. I'm not a pervert. I was doing very crucial research. Like anyone would believe that, you pervert. Damn creep. Pedophile. He felt a small, angry tick on his forehead. Hey! That's just rude. It was a shame, because he'd been fairly sure that hiding himself inside of one of his frogs and telling it that he was on a highly secret espionage mission, and that, at all costs, he couldn't be seen, had been a pretty good idea. It was a shame, then, that once the frog had realized what he'd been trying to do, he'd immediately spat him out. Directly into the middle of the women's bath. It had been even more of a shame that his clothes had still been in the frog's mouth. I'll get you all for this. If my name isn't Jiraiya, the gallant toad sage, I will have my revenge. Revenge for what? Getting caught. Get the hell out of here, you damned creep. Who the hell would say his name at a time like this? Jiraiya gave an annoyed yell, running away from the horribly rude people yelling at him. Even if it probably wasn't their fault he'd been next to naked only a few feet from them all, they could have at least been a bit more understanding about it all. Damn it, I knew I should have just ignored that old man's summons. Jiraiya looked behind him, where a massive cliff face gave way to 4 carved stone faces. All the hot springs in this crappy village are separate bath. A small, pure white snake slithered out from under a dislodged brick, sliding its way onto the palm of its master, who communicated with it very briefly, obtaining the information he needed before it entered into the man's sleeve. Well, it appears my old teammate is going to be in Konoha as well. The man laughed shrilly, walking just behind the 3 kids who would be masquerading as his students. What a touching reunion that will be. Zaku, Kin, and Dosu walked slowly, not quite trying to avoid the man, but certainly not trying to attract his attention either. He'd saved them all, rescuing them from horrid lives, but that didn't mean they had to trust him completely. They were loyal to a fault, but even they could see what he was capable of. Seems to be in a good mood today. Zaku spoke absently. Kin gave a small noise of acknowledgement, but just like their other teammate Dosu, she stayed mostly silent. Zaku sighed a bit sadly. He was a cold guy, he knew that. He'd killed people, a lot of people, in his life. But he'd just been doing what he'd had to do to survive. Life wasn't kind for a kid on the streets, especially not one as young as he'd been, in as poor a country as he'd lived. But even he felt a small, silent desire for someone, to interact with. We'll probably have a day or 2 before the exams start, he noted as he rubbed his chin. You guys want to do anything when we get there? His teammates gave him an odd look, like he was a bit crazy, before their eyes widened slightly, and a clammy albino hand came to rest on Zaku's shoulder. He looked back to find their master standing just behind him, wearing a small smile on his face. I'm afraid there won't be much time for anything extra. We'll have to go through Leaf's customs first, and that could take upwards of 2 days on its own. He pressed down just a bit harder with his hand, and Zaku felt a small jolt of pain run up his right arm. Why, had you planned on doing anything? And no, sir. He laughed nervously, trying to ignore the hissing of the snake from earlier as it slithered within his master's robes. Well, that's fine too, I suppose. The man gave a smirk at that, before falling back to his previous position, just a few paces behind them. A chill ran down Zaku's spine as he touched the place Orochimaru's hand had been just a few seconds ago, and he swallowed on nothing as he kept monotonously walking forwards. His teammates never spoke to him, they never spoke to each other, and he never spoke to them. That was how it had always been, and how, he had a sneaking suspicion, Orochimaru wanted it to stay. If they weren't friends, then there was a much better chance they'd come to him with any information they learned about each other. But am I satisfied with that? It was a simple, treacherous thought. Did he want to go behind his master's back to start making petty little friendships? No. Going behind Orochimaru's back sounded like the beginning of a horror story, one that would be punctuated with his painful death. He didn't have any inclinations that he was somehow stronger than the man, if he even was a human anymore. Sometimes, when he felt the cold clamminess of the man's hands, or the dead yellow irises that swam around his slit eyes, he couldn't help but think that maybe, just maybe, that thing wasn't too human at all. A few hours of walking later, they stumbled out of the forests, and onto a small path. Looking to his right, Zaku found a massive wall obstruct his vision, and knew immediately that this must be Konoha. Well, I suppose we've arrived. Their teacher morphed his appearance slightly, taking on a much more colorful face, and donning his sound Jonin outfit. You all know the plan from here. Act naturally. Remember, we haven't done anything to warrant suspicion. As the 3 of them stepped towards the gate, though, it was hard to miss the final words that came out of that man's cold smile. Well, not yet anyways. Chapter 12. Initiate further ado. Chapter 12. Tests of varying difficulty. So wait, Naruto spoke up, scratching his chin as he looked around. Those guys we met earlier were from the Wind Country. Yes, Zabuza sighed, looking down at the boy with a vague sense of annoyance. They were from Sunigakure. But that's what I don't get, Naruto exclaimed suddenly, pointing up at the man with gusto. 'Cause like, wind and sand are 2 totally different things, why is the country named so differently from the village? Naruto, Sasuke interjected. So are fire and leaves, but you've never thought Konohagakure was a weird name, have you? Naruto looked completely dumbfounded at this revelation, his mouth opening and closing rapidly as he tried to comprehend so many different things, like the meaning of life, the best flavor of ramen, and why people named things the way they did. But like, Sand's way dumber than leaves. That's a completely subjective statement. Sasuke spoke as he massaged his temples, trying his best to not throttle his best friend for being a complete moron. Don't use big words just cause you can. Sakura laughed from behind the trio of guys, doing her best to not become involved in this conversation, which was a philosophy that Sasuke wished he could get behind, because right now he wanted out of this as soon as possible. Could you two just shut up for like 5 seconds? Zabuza walked in front of them, but not so far that they weren't immediately recognizable as a group. That seemed to give some people pause. A few of them probably recognized the man, Sasuke guessed, as the demon of the Mist Village, and for him to suddenly be leading a group of Leaf Genin was probably quite weird. Okay, listen, the assassin of the mist turned to look at the three of them, kneeling down in front of them and putting his hands together in front of his face. I didn't do jack shit to train you guys for this. Very true. Sakura spoke, which earned her a glare from the man speaking. But Zabuza continued with a huff. I have a hell of a lot of faith in you idiots. A whole lot of faith that you've literally done nothing but test for the past hour and a half. That's a bit rude. Naruto spoke lackadaisically. Shut it! The man exclaimed. Okay, I'll just be honest. I like you kids, honestly, I do. You're a tough bunch, and you work better together than a lot of Jonin squads I've been on before, so I really do think you guys could go far in this thing. Zabuza rubbed the back of his head, and whether it was because of his honesty in saying that he liked them, or just a general nervousness in jinxing them, Sasuke couldn't tell. But you also shouldn't underestimate anybody here. You have to remember that some of them have the same goals and aspirations that you do. Treat every opponent with the respect they deserve, nothing more, nothing less. Hope for the best, expect the worst, and don't forget to work together. Zabuza commanded, pushing Sasuke and Sakura into the main building, and practically throwing Naruto. Now get the hell out of my sight! And if I have to see you before the third stage of the exam, then each one of you is getting some practical training with yours truly. The man slammed the door behind him, and the three of them were left alone in complete silence. It probably shouldn't have been, what with the 40 or so other people in the room with them, but none of them dared to speak either. Huh! Naruto exclaimed a second or two later, standing up and dusting himself off. That guy's kinda mean. Sasuke just sighed. Naruto had absolutely no clue what he was supposed to do, which was a feeling he was becoming intimately familiar with. He'd be the first to admit that he didn't much care for studying. It was boring, for a start, and a complete waste of his time, which was much better spent pranking some crappy ninjas in the shopping district, or polishing up his shuriken throwing skills. He'd been banking on the Chunin exams being a test of your skills in combat. After all, what separated a genin from a jonin if not the strength of their attacks? Well, apparently it was a bit more than Naruto had thought. And to think, I completely brushed Sakura off when she offered to study with me. Naturally, his fate had been sealed the moment he doubted the girl for a second. The universe had once again flipped back into a state of vehemently hating Naruto Uzumaki and declared that the first test of the Chunin exams would, of course, be a written one. He glared at nothing in particular, grumbling under his breath as he stared down at the questions before him. He nearly fainted as he read a question involving trigonometry, a concept he was sure he'd been taught, but one he'd never even begun to understand. He looked around the room, trying to locate anything that could potentially save him from his predicament, and found nothing. Nothing, except, of course, one Sakura Harino, who was quietly and dutifully writing down her answers onto the small leaflet in front of her, looking like she could just as easily answer any of the mind-bending puzzles as she did take out the trash in the morning. He gave a small wave to her, and her gaze rose to meet his. "Help me?" he mouthed silently. The girl gave him a look of smug satisfaction, mouthed back sounds like someone should have studied, before she turned back to her paper, pretending as if she'd never seen him at all. "Traitor!" he whispered just a bit too loudly. A quiet scribbling sound made him turn around, and Naruto gulped as he saw one of the exam's proctors gazing directly at him, raising an eyebrow in a challenging way, almost as if to say, "You want to talk again?" He gave the man as intimidating of a glare as he could muster, which seemed to only amuse the adult ninja, who smiled as he looked away from him and towards a red-haired boy, who was currently covering one of his eyes with his hand. He'd met the boy only briefly, as him and his team, all of whom hailing from the Wind Country, had entered the Leaf Village. They'd of course completely ignored him, focusing only on Sasuke, making all sorts of bold claims about how they'd defeat him, and that he'd be felled by their hands. It hadn't even stopped when they'd arrived at the venue either, as they'd immediately been pulled aside by some super buff kid with a bowl cut, who then, naturally, challenged Sasuke to a duel. "Every single one of you punks can screw off," Naruto thought with no small amount of annoyance. "He was my rival way before you people even heard of him." Still, he had to admit that said bowl-cut touting kid had been pretty impressive, managing to surpass Sasuke's speed without much effort. Naruto was pretty sure that with his new Sharingan, his friend could have taken the boy, but even then, it wouldn't have been easy. But what the hell even is the Sharingan? Naruto couldn't help but ponder, scratching his chin as he leaned back in his chair. Like, is it his irises? Or is it like, his pupils? Excuse me? Is it the whites of his dash? No, it can't be that, the whites don't change. Naruto-kun? Is it his brain? I mean, it has to be, right? He's born with the Sharingan, but Sasuke said it develops over time. Wait, that's even more confusing. A light tap on his arm caught his attention, and he turned to see the blushing face of one Hinata Hyuga, who looked more than a little nervous. "Hinata?" he whispered as quietly as he could, just loud enough for the girl beside him to hear, but hopefully, not loud enough for the proctors to catch it. "What's up?" The girl didn't say anything at first. Well, that wasn't true, she certainly said something, but it was barely intelligible past her mumbling, and so the only word he caught of it was help. I don't really know much about this stuff," Naruto admitted painfully. "I can't help you much, Hinata." "And no." He looked back up at her, and saw an expression that looked like determination set on her face. "I said that I want to help you," the girl whispered just a bit louder, and he couldn't help but feel both warm and ashamed at what she said. "So, she thinks I need help, huh?" Naruto thought to himself. "Even if I know she's right, it doesn't make it feel any better." But he'd gotten pretty good at accepting the facts recently, what with 1,000 different things being thrown at him every moment of every day, and so he'd come to accept that he'd never be some mega genius like Sasuke, or book smart like Sakura. If he wanted to compete with them, go on to the next stage of the exams with them, then he'd have to accept those truths. He was just about to take whatever help it was Hinata was offering when he heard that same scratching come from behind him. Naruto turned around, and locked eyes with the same proctor from before. The man simply raised his eyebrow. He gritted his teeth, but turned back to the girl beside him, nonetheless. "Sorry, Hinata, but I can't do that." But Naruto, you. He tried to be subtle with the slight motion of his head, trying to show her they were being watched, observed at all times. "I wouldn't want you to get in trouble for my sake." He smiled down at her to show he wasn't mad or anything. To her credit, the girl beside him clearly caught on, clamming up and turning back towards the table in front of her. She lowered her head a second later, becoming incredibly small. It made it all the more surprising for Naruto when, even still, she pushed her answer sheet towards him and gave him a minuscule smile. "I used my Byakugan to take the answers from the person in front of me. I know the proctors caught it, because I heard them scribble that down." Hinata looked up at him, seeming oddly confident. "And I think cheating's the point of this exam." Naruto couldn't quite see the leap in logic there. "Wait, what?" "Well, earlier, you accidentally shouted out to Sakura." "Oh crap, was it that loud?" "And I know the proctors saw it and heard it, because they all, at least most of them in the room wrote that down." "Oh crap, it was that loud." Hinata suddenly moved towards him, eyes full of an unusual fire, and she took a moment to blush and calm herself down. So that's why I think. If we weren't supposed to cheat, then, Naruto, you would have already failed." She brought her hands together in front of her, fiddling with her thumbs in a way Naruto could tell meant she was nervous. "Plus, if we weren't supposed to cheat, then they would have already caught me, so that's how I know for sure. Naruto felt like there was an awful lot to dissect there but couldn't help but look above him as a small shadow graced over his section of the table, and saw an eyeball, an honest-to-goodness eyeball, floating just a few feet above him. He held back the instinctive scream that he felt would have been appropriate, instead gulping and turning back to Hinata, choosing to ignore what he'd just seen entirely. Hinata, you could be right, and cheating could be the point of this exam, but there's also another possibility. What's that? What if the proctors could tell that my attempt at cheating was unsuccessful? Naruto spoke quietly, gauging the reaction on the girl's face. She seemed to ponder his words for a moment, before she rose up again, shaking her head. Even if that's true, then they still would have caught me after I took the answers. What makes you think that? Naruto had to ask, leaning towards the girl a bit. From what I understand, which to be fair isn't a ton, your eyes let you see through things, right? The girl twiddled her thumbs once more. Among other things, yes. So, what I'm trying to say is that your eyes are pretty hidden on their own. It wouldn't be hard to believe that the proctors just didn't catch something like that. Naruto felt he'd outlined his reasoning pretty solidly, but the girl in front of him didn't seem so sure. He couldn't help but ask the question that burned in his mind. Why are you so convinced that you couldn't do it? The girl gave a small squeak, and it seemed to Naruto that he'd hit the nail on the head. Hinata faltered for quite a long time, looking just about anywhere other than him. As she gazed above her and saw the floating eyeball he'd seen earlier, she gave another squeak, notably louder than the first one. The Hyuga girl turned back towards him, seeming a bit downtrodden as she tried to formulate a sentence. It was a bit weird, but as he watched the girl fumble around with her words, the expression on her face falling by the second, he instantly realized what was wrong. Hinata, why don't you have any faith in yourself? It was a mistake, saying that. He knew it immediately, from the way the girl's entire body scrunched up, how her figure became smaller, how she nearly disappeared from view entirely. I'm sorry, he interjected. I didn't mean to. It's fine, Naruto. The girl spoke sadly, turning to face him with a pathetic expression upon her face. She looked like an abused puppy. Something within him, the part of him that Sasuke called perceptive at the worst of times, told him that his analogy wasn't so far from the truth. He shook his head, not waiting for the girl to speak up again. No, it wasn't fine. Sakura had told him before that he could be just a bit too insensitive, a bit too prying, and once again those parts of him had reared their ugly heads. I wasn't really respecting your boundaries. You don't have to tell me anything. That sounded good, and he was pretty sure he remembered what his teammates had told him he wasn't very good at doing. Hinata smiled up at him. Thank you? She turned back towards her paper, looking like she felt just a bit better than she had the minute before. It made him feel a tad better as well. Even if he wasn't as strong a ninja as Sasuke was, or if he wasn't as smart as Sakura, he felt like he understood people's problems more than the other two did. It's a bit of an odd skill, Naruto admitted with a light chuckle. But it's mine, I suppose? Very well, 45 minutes have passed. I will now administer the 10th question. Wait, what? How long was I talking to Hinata? Naruto looked at the clock, which had indeed just passed the 9th notch, and towards the head examiner, who was now reading off the rules for the 10th question. He gazed down at his own paper. Not a single word written. Why do these things only happen to me? This office is the same as ever, a white-haired man spoke as he stepped inside. Boring as all hell. I swear, Sensei, you really should redecorate the place. Yes, I'm sure you'd like that. His old master responded, looking up from his papers and giving him a tired expression. Did you receive my message? Geez, straight to business? Jiraiya couldn't help but spout out as he walked over to the desk, standing a few feet in front of it. You're growing so cold in your old age, old man. And you're growing awfully brazen in yours. Hiruzen replied, giving him a small smile. Ha! I haven't aged a day. I'm the spitting image of myself from the war. Remind me to call a doctor for you later? Oh? Yes, a small gleam of mirth entered the man's practically deadened eyes. It appears you need to have both your head and eyes checked. Jiraiya gave a wry laugh at that one, giving in to his own amusement for a few seconds, before he gave in to the rather heavy mood. So, you're sure of it? Orochimaru's really moving? Yes, our spies say so, and you know that if Orochimaru wanted to disappear completely, then he could. Hiruzen took a long draw of his pipe, sighing out the smoke a second later. The fact that our agents found him at all shows that he's up to something. He can't be nearly as covert if he's moving his pieces. Hey, you always did like your shogi analogies. Would it kill you to be serious for half a second, my old student? I'm not sure, I've never tried. He gave him an amused smile, but it dropped off his face a second later at seeing the look on his old master's face. There's something else worrying you, isn't there? Yes, quite a few things, honestly. Hiruzen leaned back in his chair, seeming to sink into the light fabric as he gave a long sigh. We have Orochimaru's unseen scheme, the Akatsuki going eerily quiet, and what's worse, there was an incident with the Ninetales just a few weeks ago that we were still dealing with, and of course all of these events have to overlap with the Chunin exams. Whoa, I didn't hear anything about the Ninetales. Jiraiya couldn't quite hide his worry. That was his student's son, after all. What happened? The fox gave us quite the scare, nearly took over his Jinchuriki's body a few weeks back. He was subdued by Zabuza Momochi, the demon of the mist. Hiruzen looked up at him seriously. Have you heard of him? Just in passing, I've never met the guy, if that's what you're asking. Well, you might get the chance. He's been annexed in as a pending member of the Leaf Village's ninja corps. Wait, Jiraiya felt like he was missing something there. I'm sorry, what? His old sensei gave a completely honest laugh, one of the very few he'd heard from him in quite a number of years. Can you see how I've been a tad exhausted lately? It's a bit of a long story, but the short version is that our resident Jinchuriki's team is odd. Yeah, you still seem to be underselling it. Perhaps I am, just a tad. But I think I can see the big picture. Jiraiya sighed as he looked his teacher in the eye, and the man gave him a nod. You called me back not only as some added defense against Orochimaru, but also so I can watch the nine-tailed kid too, yeah? Humph, the old man gave a small chuckle. You understand then? He couldn't help but sigh again as he felt his expected workload for the coming weeks nearly triple in half a second, but nodded anyways. Yeah, I got it. Jiraiya let out, waving his hand in a dispelling motion. How do you want me to go about it? I'd like you to teach the boy more about his powers, and to train him while you're at it. Hiruzen's eyes darkened, looking up at his student with a small fire behind his eyes. Our Jinchuriki could use the strength, what with the Akatsuki threatening to attack him at any time. Got it. He walked backwards towards the door, content enough with their little rendezvous to leave it there. Oh, and Jiraiya? Yeah? Do try to stay on the men's side of the baths from now on. His teacher gave him a disappointed look, taking a hit from his pipe that struck him as unimpressed. I've received enough reports about you peeping on women to last a lifetime. Jiraiya felt his face grow hot, which was a feeling he'd become quite familiar with, and ran out of the room. He screamed one final thing as he ran down the spiral staircase. I swear, it was just research. Welp, Zaka thought, as he rose from his seat and walked to stand with his other teammates. That was surprisingly easy. The exam, if one could even call it that, had consisted of 9 questions that didn't matter, and the choice of whether or not to pass on to the second stage. How could they be stupid enough to fall for something like that? He couldn't help but snicker to himself. Never once in the exam's history have they ever barred future applicants from competing again. Of course it was a bluff. He hadn't wanted to spoil it, of course. Any of the people who'd be fooled by something so simple didn't deserve to be Chunin at all. Or maybe I should have told them, let them all pass through. He thought as he waved to his teammates, who both gave a non-committal wave back. Gods know this place could do with having their chaff culled, and I hear the second test is a whole lot more deadly. He and his teammates walked ahead of most of the others leaving the exam site, heading down towards the forest of death at a more immediate pace. It wasn't to try and earn points with the proctor, or any such nonsense, but a far more deep-rooted problem. They didn't like being around each other. It wasn't overt, in that they avoided one another entirely or couldn't bear to speak to each other. It was far more subtle than that. It was like when their eyes met, they'd look the other way without so much as a word. Or if they ran into one another at the compound, they'd pass by one another without exchanging a greeting. Oh, they'd talk, but only in a fickle manner. They'd ask the other how they'd been doing, the other would reply that they were fine, and they'd walk along as if they never so much as seen the other. They talked like they were being forced to talk. If Zaku were being honest with himself, he wasn't particularly satisfied with that. It was a quiet thought, though, one that drifted within his head like a passing wind. With Orochimaru around, he didn't dare act on it. He wouldn't put it past the man to watch their every move, just to see if he would go along with his idea from the other day to invite his teammates out. It seemed a bit petty, if he were being honest. Just like him, I suppose? He snickered to himself. Zaku nearly jumped out of his skin as Orochimaru himself seemed to melt out of the wall in front of them a second later, clad in his Jonin outfit, looking just a bit too pleased with himself. Can he, read minds or something? Good, you've all passed. The man gave the three of them a sly grin. Not that I expected anything different, but it would have been quite the irritant for you to flunk out so early. All three of them felt a small chill at the man's words and could tell what he was saying. They outlived their usefulness the moment they were removed from the competition. If Zaku guessed, Orochimaru needed a good excuse to be hanging around the Leaf Village, and his role as their Jonin sensei was as good of one as any. That was probably his plan A, to enter into the final stages of the competition by writing their accomplishments. But he knew the man well enough to know that it wouldn't be his only plan. Contingencies upon contingencies, Orochimaru took no chances when it came to his ideas. If the three of them proved to be useless, the man wouldn't bother with them any further than to throw them away. And doesn't that thought leave me feeling all warm and fuzzy? Proceed normally through the next exam, their master told them, giving each of them a bit of an unnerving look. Although, I'd like to have you hunt down a particularly interesting prospect for me. Who, sir? Dosu spoke up, being the de facto leader of their group, and overall the only one who could even stand speaking in Orochimaru's presence. I'll let you know later, if he ends up passing my little test. The man's malicious grin gave them all pause. Oh, and I have another infiltrator in this exam aside from the three of you, just as a backup, we'll call it. Zaku gulped, knowing that their place in this plan had just become even more unimportant. You've met each other, though it would be best for your two groups to not intermingle, what with the risks that would entail. The man spoke his words like they were made of honey, though each one of them only made Zaku feel sick. Rest assured, they have their own tasks. They won't be encroaching on your mission. Thank you, sir. Dosu bowed deeply, before gesturing to the three of them. Shall we go to the test site, sir? Yes, I suppose I've nothing left for the three of you. Orochimaru stepped away, walking over into a tree, and literally melting into it. Just before he was about to disappear completely, his face turned back towards the three of them. Do try to become Chunin, you all. He smiled in a predatory way, and Zaku's instincts screamed at him to get away. The opportunities for senior ninja are often far greater than that of those in the lower rungs. Do well in this mission, and you become more important. A second later, Orochimaru was gone. His heart wouldn't stop pounding, even as the seconds ticked by. Even as Zaku and his team stepped out into the clearing where a handful of students stood waiting for the exam to begin, it never ceased to beat as hard and as fast as it could. It seemed to scream at him to run away, to get as far away from that man as he possibly could. Perhaps he already knew, on an instinctive level, that staying with Orochimaru could only ever end in his death, but that didn't particularly matter. He'd been trapped and caught by that man so very long ago, the very moment their eyes met in that abandoned alley he'd scrounged for food in. One passing glance, one fleeting interest, and his fate had been sealed. He'd been deemed useful, and had air tubes carved into his arms to prove it. And Orochimaru didn't let go of things that interested him, not until they broke. Or stopped being interesting. Zaku couldn't help but laugh a bit morbidly as he thought that, causing his teammates to give him odd looks. The same thing seemed to happen to both. Chapter 13. The last thing Naruto heard Sasuke say before he was blasted half a mile into the forest of death was "Look out." As he tumbled through branch after branch, feeling like his bones would give out at any second, he couldn't quite shake the feeling that his friend's warning had come just a tiny bit too late. They'd been, well, not ambushed per se, because it was hard to be ambushed by a snake the size of a stadium, but attacked by one. It has also just so happened to sneak into their little encampment without very much difficulty at all, separating the three of them from one another. He finally slid to a stop in a small outcropping, and laid there for just a second as he assessed the damage from his little trip. Arms? Working. Legs? Functional. Ribs? Well, still there at least. He stood a bit painfully, though he knew that even that damage would be gone within a few minutes. Being the Ninetales vessel came with some perks. He dusted himself off, which did almost nothing for the pound of grime that now stuck to his clothes like glue, and took a look around. Now, where the hell am I? He pondered that thought for a good half-second before dismissing it. He didn't know a single thing about the Forest of Death, and was fairly sure that even if he had been knocked into a place they'd already visited, he would have had no idea anyways. So I'm lost and alone in a place that's literally called the Forest of Death. Great. He kicked a tree root out of frustration, gave a small whine at the pain in his foot, and then set off towards the trail he'd left behind upon landing. It was as good an idea as any to try and follow it back to his friends, as he figured he'd have just as good of a chance of survival fighting a giant snake with them than he would being alone with whatever else was out here. Well, at least I won't have to deal with another one of those. He cursed himself almost immediately, looking around with no small bit of panic. If I know the universe well enough, I know that I'm about to be attacked by. He screamed quite loudly as he barely dodged the maw of another giant snake, juking through massive tree roots that snaked through the forest like a titanic spiderweb. He just managed to duck under the creature's gaping maw as it soared over him, impacting against one of the colossal tree trunks, and heard more than saw its skull break. He cringed just a bit as the snake's corpse slid off the branches around him, and fell to the ground below him with a mighty crash. Okay, I officially hate this place. He thought he heard someone's voice, a woman's, echo off to his left, and turned towards the source of the noise. He found someone that he was fairly sure he should have known, but didn't. Hey. He called out to the girl, who was standing on a branch about 15 feet from him, looking a bit pensive. Hey. There was a pause that seemed to last an eternity. So, what you doin'? The girl gave a small sigh, before closing the distance between them in a fraction of a second, landing just in front of him on the thick branch. You don't have your team's scroll, do you? He didn't. No? The girl gave a small sigh, falling back onto the rough bark beneath her with a pout etched firmly onto her face. Well, great. This was a waste of time. Naruto couldn't help but scowl a bit at her muttering. It was a waste of time to try and find someone screaming for help. The kunoichi in front of him gave him a dry sort of look, like it was somehow his fault he almost got killed by a giant snake. I didn't say that, did I? The girl twirled a kunai on her finger absent-mindedly, keeping a constant watch on her surroundings as she did. I don't have my team's scroll, if that's what you're looking for. I hadn't even thought of that. Okay. Another pause, and Naruto couldn't help his cheeks heating up at that one. He was usually so good at talking to people, too. Well, mostly. So, what's your name? He felt he might as well try and initiate conversation. If it was possible for the girl to look any more annoyed with him, she managed it, giving him what was possibly the coldest stare he'd ever received. I'm Naruto. I know your name. The girl responded, sighing, rolling her eyes and, for the first time since she'd come over, truly relaxing. You don't have any traps set up, do you? She spoke disappointedly. What? The girl slapped herself in the face, dragging her hand down slowly, until just her eyes were visible. I've been treating you like a threat this entire time, and you've just been trying to talk to me? Was that not what I was supposed to be doing? Yeah? Why should I not have been? You do know that this test is basically a free-for-all, right? The girl explained as she dug her kunai into the bark below her, carving a design into it with slow, precise movements. Anyone who's not on your team is an enemy. Yeah, I know that. The girl glared daggers at him. That makes me your enemy, doofus. He thought about that for a second, finding himself sitting down across from her as he did. The girl scooted back a few feet, and he noticed that she had her kunai at the ready, just in case he tried anything. I guess we're supposed to be enemies, but you just didn't give me that feeling when I saw you. What are you talking about? I mean, earlier, when we encountered this guy from the grass village, I got this feeling in my gut. It was telling me to get as far away from him as I could. Naruto still shivered whenever he thought of that man. Something about him had seemed too unnatural. But when I saw you, I just felt normal. So I guess I just assumed you didn't mean me any harm. He felt like his reasoning didn't sound quite so solid when he had to explain it, but he still gave the girl his trademark smile as he looked up at her. To his immense relief, the girl laughed. It wasn't a lengthy affair, more of a snort than anything, but it was a start, and perhaps a sign that she was warming up to him a little. You know, Naruto, you're a bit of an idiot. Or not, I suppose? She held her hand out a second later, offering to let him shake it. My name's Tenten. She gave him a sedated smile. I guess I'm a bit of an idiot too. He didn't so much as hesitate, taking her hand in his own and giving it a small shake. So, why are you out here alone? I could ask the same of you. The kunoichi responded, going back to carving her design into their branch. Though, I suppose you gave me your name first, so I might as well answer in kind. My team leader, well, I won't give you any useful information, just in case we end up fighting sometime. Hey! Oh, come on, Tenten huffed. That's just common sense, and you know it. Yeah, I know, doesn't mean I didn't want to have something to tell those two when I saw them again. He could just see how cool he would have been if he'd come back with some juicy information, too. Basically, my team leader split us all up, because he was confident in our ability to collect scrolls on our own. She seemed to be thinking of how best to speak her words. You've met Lee, right? The bushy-browed guy. Tenten snorted. Yeah, you met Lee. Anyways, he was actually trying to find you guys. I think he's got a thing for the pink-haired girl. Now it was Naruto's turn to laugh. Really? Yep. I hate to be rude, because frankly, Lee doesn't have a single mean bone in his body, but he doesn't have a chance with her. What? But he's such a nice guy. Tenten gave him a deadpan expression. Being a nice guy can only get you so far when you look and dress like that. Well, his personality is. And you exclusively talk about exercising. Alright, you got me. Naruto gave up, raising both his hands in the air in defeat. The girl before him gave a small chuckle at that, before she turned suddenly, eyes wide. Do you feel that? No, what's? There was a sudden rush of something that Naruto couldn't quite describe. It wasn't fear, because he had nothing to attach it to. If anything, he would have called it an extreme sense of foreboding. And then he heard a girl scream. His face paled within a second, and he was up almost instantly, rushing towards the sound with all of the energy within his body. That was Sakura's voice. A second or so after Naruto was blasted away, the Snake Rider was back on them. Sasuke couldn't help but stumble a bit as he and Sakura dodged around the massive reptile's strikes. His thigh ached where he'd stabbed himself earlier, in order to break himself out of his own head, but instead of trying to ignore it, he focused on it. Every tiny feeling, every jolt that ran up his leg reminded him that he was still alive, that man hadn't killed him yet, he wouldn't kill him. Another dodge, but this time, the snake just barely scraped Sakura's side, sending her spiraling to the floor some 50 feet below them. For a civilian, that fall would have been fatal, but his teammate was a ninja, and managed to control her descent just enough to land safely, rolling to a stop on the ground. Not bad, not bad. The grass genin spoke, rubbing his chin with his right hand, before smiling in a way that seemed so unnatural to Sasuke, like the man had been taught to smile, but never really learned it. Sasuke already knew what he needed to do. Somehow, someway. I need to get rid of that snake. It was what was doing the real damage, keeping them from focusing on its rider. It cut through any barricade they tried to hide behind, even some of the thicker branches were cut apart like paper behind the creature's bulk. There's an idea, though. Sasuke did his absolute best to feign a stumble, to pretend like the pain in his leg was getting to him too much for him to even stand. Truly? The shrill voice of the grass ninja called out, sounding almost disappointed. I suppose if that's all. He heard a menacing hiss, and then felt the air around him change, could almost feel the hot breath of the snake close in on him. He dodged at the last possible moment, just barely ducking under the creature's maw, and heard an earth-shattering crash as its skull impacted the massive tree trunk behind him. There was a sickening sound of liquid pouring, and then the snake began to fall, its corpse echoing off the floor of the forest as it met the earth. For just a second, Sasuke thought he'd gotten the rider as well with that feint. Ho ho. It appears I have called this too quickly. Shit. He turned around to where the voice had come from but found nothing. Instead, the voice began to echo off of the forest's leaves, in a very hollow way. Looking for someone? He turned with breakneck speed, but it wasn't enough to block the blow to his stomach that came in, knocking him back with more force than even the Ninetales blows had. He retched as he landed, trying to force some air back into his lungs. His eyes widened as he saw a flash of pink hair, as it charged forward with a weapon drawn. There was a quick exchange before, just like him, Sakura was knocked back, landing a few feet from him in a heap. Sakura. I'm fine. The girl's voice made it clear that she was anything but Sasuke was far too exhausted to protest it at this point. We need a plan, he offered. Genius idea, never before seen. No need to be rude. The grass ninja gave a small laugh, before, with a bend in his neck that nearly caused the Uchiha to vomit, he charged at the two of them. Sasuke just barely intercepted, taking the blow on the tip of his kunai. At any other time, he was fairly sure the man's hand would have split in two from meeting a blade head-on, but instead, the man's clenched hand batted away the weapon like it was a child's toy. What the hell are you? He let out between slightly panicked breaths. Me? Their assailant pointed to himself, looking almost hurt. I'm just a little old genin from the grass village, of course. There was a twinge of glee in the man's voice that sent a chill down Sasuke's spine. It made him feel like he was being toyed with, like he had absolutely no control over the situation at hand. It reminded him of when he'd fought Haku. It reminded him of when he'd been spared by his brother, on nothing more than a whim. He felt a familiar feeling in the back of his skull, and he allowed his Sharingan to spin into life a second or two later. Their opponent let out a shrill moan, walking towards Sasuke slowly, like a predator sure of the kill. There it is, the power of the Uchiha clan. Was this what he wanted? It bothered Sasuke more than he cared to admit, but that didn't mean the Sharingan wasn't also his best chance in this battle. He charged forwards, making the signs for the fireball jutsu as he did. As he finished, he drew his kunai from before back into his hand, readying himself as best he could. Fire style, fireball jutsu. He unleashed his blaze across the branches, searing everything in its path. He poured more chakra into the jutsu than normal, and hoped that it would be enough to simply burn apart the ground the man stood upon, but instead, a second later, he saw the man charge out of his peripheral vision, a wide smile set upon his face. It was Sakura who answered his attack, forcing the man to halt his advance as a mud wall popped up between them. Sasuke thought briefly about the fact that there was no dirt for the wall to pull from where they were standing, a good 50 feet off the ground, but decided he didn't much care if it saved his life. A hand came through the barrier of mud, seeming unperturbed by it at all. Sasuke dodged just past it, his eyes allowing him to avoid the blow almost lackadaisically. A second later, the wall itself exploded. Their assailant came charging forward, yet he had still not drawn a weapon, nor casted a jutsu of any kind. Sasuke blocked the attack with the back of his hand, even anticipated the man's next one, sneaking his own kunai into the ninja's gut. It was a perfect counter, and he smiled as he went for what he knew would be the finishing blow. It made it all the more shocking when, instead of plunging in and stopping the man's assault, it merely melted into the man's muddy skin. A clone! All the warning he had was a scream from Sakura, and then his world exploded with pain. You're strong. Their opponent spoke amusedly, walking over to where Sasuke was crumbled onto the floor and letting out a shrill laugh. Come on now, don't you have any more tricks for me? Sasuke took a second to take stock of what he had left. A few 100 feet of metal wire, a few tiny explosives, 10 or so shuriken, and 4 more kunai. Is that enough? Probably not. He grit his teeth as he touched his chest, knowing for a fact that one of the ribs on his left side was broken. He'd been struck from there after the clone had melted into mud, and he tried his best to land safely, but it just hadn't been enough. That didn't mean he could stay down, though. He drew forth the miniature explosives, holding them in his left hand as he turned himself around, looking up at their assailant, still wearing that damned smile on his face. Is that all you have for me, last remnant of the Uchiha? A small static shock ran up his legs, his chest, into his arms. It spread throughout him. He felt the pain from his side dull somewhat, felt his eyes hone in, felt his fists clench. He wasn't quite sure what it was, a mixture between adrenaline and anger, but whatever it happened to be, Sasuke knew that it was the only chance he had. He moved suddenly, without warning. It was enough, even, for the ninja in front of him to be surprised, raising a single hand to block his incoming fist. That was what he'd been looking for, as he threw the explosives out of his left hand, underneath the man's guard. The man's body bent backwards as they went off, and he let out a shrill shriek. It isn't enough, not yet. Sasuke drew the wire, doing his best to separate it into 3 lengths, and tying them to 6 of the remaining shuriken in his bag as fast as he could, threw them forward with all his remaining strength. Ha! So this is the power you still hold? The grass ninja shouted out, and for just a second, a different voice covered the shrill, almost girlish one from before. It sounded unlike anything Sasuke had heard before. But he ignored it, ignored the distraction, and pulled the wires taut at just the right moment. They tied around the man's frame, holding him fast against the trunk of the tree he stood against. Time to end this. He held another wire, one that served as a connector between him and the ninja, between his teeth. He held his hand seals up to it, creating an easy line for his jutsu to follow. Fire style, dragon flame jutsu. The flames roared to life, coasting across the metal wire with ease, and crashed into the grass ninja's body with a resounding roar. The man screamed in agony, but Sasuke couldn't let up. He knew that if he let go for even a second, then this man would escape. He'd shown to be too powerful, too dangerous for Sasuke to let him live. He wouldn't risk his teammates' lives for something as petty as his own innocence. The screams died down 30 or so seconds later, as the man's burnt corpse slid to the bottom of the trunk, and became incredibly still. Sasuke let out a breath he hadn't known he'd been holding, falling slack onto the branch below him with a sigh of relief. Why you did it, Sasuke? His teammate, Sakura, ran over to him, immediately taking his arm and inspecting it for injuries, moving on to his ribs after she'd finished. Honestly, that was way too risky. You saw that guy, Sakura. He spoke past his exhaustion. I didn't have much choice other than to be a little risky. A laugh echoed out across the forest, cutting through their relieved mood like a knife. Excellent. Simply excellent. The man was clapping, driving his charred and rotting hands together time and time again. Sasuke realized with some horror that the skin around the man's eye was melting off, and underneath was another, separate skin. It was albino, a shockingly pure white, but it was more so the eye that got his attention. It was a deep, horrifying yellow. It looked like the eye of an animal, nothing like that of the human being this creature was pretending to be. Who the hell are you? Sasuke felt the compulsion to scream. The man's smile made him shiver, as his face melted even farther, and his voice continued to change, becoming one that sounded almost sickly with age, ringing completely hollow, carrying no emotion at all. My name is Orochimaru. The man brought his hands up, forming an odd seal that Sasuke realized he'd seen before. It was the same seal that Kakashi had used to activate his Manjikyu Sharingan. I do feel terrible to have to interrupt our little jaunt so suddenly, the man's voice called out, as his neck dislocated from his body, falling a bit too far to the side. But I had originally come to test your abilities. To think you'd impress me so. The man gave another laugh, before, with a sickening crack, his neck elongated to a ridiculous degree, closing the distance between them in a matter of moments. Sasuke! It happened too fast for him to so much as move. The man's head opened wide, too wide for a human, and his teeth seemed to extend unnaturally. He felt hands contact with his side, felt it flare up in agony, and looked to see Sakura pushing him. It wasn't very far, a few inches at most, but it was enough. The man's head didn't catch it, couldn't see that Sasuke had been displaced, and so still aimed for the last place he'd seen the boy occupy. There was a wet squelch, and a horrified gasp as he fell to the ground. He almost couldn't bear to look up, to see what had happened, but he knew he must. He forced his eyes to move up his teammate's body, to look above him at her form, and to see the man's teeth digging into her neck. The head pulled away, dragging itself back to its body with another few cracks of bones rearranging themselves. You were not the intended target. Sakura fell to her knees, clutching her shoulder. A second later Sasuke saw a black mark begin to form, just above where she'd been bitten. And then she screamed. It wasn't quite like anything he'd heard from her before. It was elongated, drawn out, and continuous. Her eyes widened, and she fell backwards, scratching at her neck where the seal was with a horrid vigor, cutting her own skin as she desperately tried to remove whatever it was this man had placed on her. Sasuke practically flew towards her, kneeling down and grabbing her hand, keeping her from clawing open her own skin. What the hell did you do to her? Orochimaru seemed oddly confused, like he never thought this could happen to him. That gift was intended for you, I suppose. The both of you will have to receive one. He brought his hands back up, reforming the same seal he'd used earlier, but Sasuke knew now what was coming. His Sharingan spun back into being, and he prepared to intercept it. Except for the fact that he couldn't move. He felt the same piercing fear from earlier cloud his thoughts, his muscles. His body faltered, and he felt a panic as he watched the man's head come barreling towards him. This time I think I'll be more careful. The man was emitting an aura so potent, so obviously powerful, that Sasuke could barely feel anything at all. Do be a dear and hold still for me. At least until a ninja dressed in orange, with hair the color of gold, came rocketing into the arena, kicking the man's head into a tree as he landed next to his teammates. Sorry I'm late. Sasuke couldn't quite hide his relief as he looked upon his teammate. He hadn't thought that Naruto would die, or anything silly like that, but he'd been worried for him all the same. Sakura let out another scream, and suddenly any semblance of happiness at Team 7's reunion vanished. What's wrong with her? I don't know. That guy over there, he did something to her. The man in question brought his head back, straightening it with his left hand and looking rather annoyed. So, the nine-tailed brat emerges as well. Orochimaru took a single step forward, before he was bombarded with weapons from above him, giving a single TSK as he bobbed and weaved through all of them. Another combatant, a girl Sasuke recognized vaguely as a member of Rock Lee's team, landed next to them in a crouch, glaring daggers at Naruto. Who the hell is this guy? You said they were fighting another one of those snakes. Well, they were fighting a snake, I just forgot mention that someone was riding it. His friend turned to him. Sasuke, who the hell is this guy? There was an awful lot to process there, and Sasuke felt prepared for almost none of it. Another scream poured out of Sakura, who was rapidly tensing and untensing her muscles. It was like she was stuck in a nightmare while still awake. He called himself Orochimaru, Wait, what? It was the other girl who spoke, looking stunned beyond belief. Why? Who's that? Naruto asked, looking just a bit confused. The girl's hands shook as she looked over at the man, who seemed to be sizing them all up momentarily. Orochimaru was on the same team as Jiraiya and Tsunade. There was a momentary pause, during which the girl looked back at the two of them annoyedly. Do you seriously not know who they are? No, Naruto admitted, rubbing the back of his head. I remember those other two. Sasuke spoke quietly, trying to control the shaking in his hands. They were supposedly some of the most powerful ninja to ever come out of the Leaf Village. Because of their achievements in the Second Shinobi World War, they were dubbed the Sannin. The brown-haired girl interrupted, holding a bow staff in her left hand. They're frighteningly strong. I didn't know Orochimaru was. Sasuke looked over at the man, who seemed to be finished sizing them up, and was now walking towards them, quite confidently, as if he'd already caught them. Then what the hell do we do? Naruto seemed to catch on to their panic, now shaking a bit as well. We do the only thing we can do, the girl said, taking a step backwards as she turned to look at Naruto, and then at Sasuke, carrying Sakura in his arms. We run.